Hey everyone, today we're going to explain the key terms for Period 5 of APUSH history. This would be a great way to either start the unit or review before a test. Many of these terms come directly from the College Board framework, so are likely to be vocabulary seen on AP exams. Okay, let's go. The first term we're going to start out with is Antebellum. I've seen my students get stumped on this term in the past, when it has appeared on questions. It simply means before the war, and for APUSH, it typically refers to the South in periods 4 and 5, before the Civil War, so before 1861. Which is a society largely centered on cash crops, slavery, and large plantations. Next, we have manifest destiny, a term that will have many consequences for the United States and its neighbors. It is a belief that the expansion of the United States throughout the North American continent was both justified and inevitable. This powerful idea will lead to violent conflict like the Mexican-American War and countless wars, battles, and atrocities between the United States military, settlers, and many different Native American tribes. And also land treaties and purchases like the Oregon Treaty and the Gadsden Purchase. Remembering back to Period 4, the Northwest and South had their own goals in terms of tariffs, a national bank, and infrastructure. This led to some political problems, especially around Clay's American system, as South Carolina attempted to nullify federal tariffs, and the topic of slavery began to become divisive, leading to a gag rule to be passed on the subject in the House of Representatives. So in the early part of Period 5, those issues are basically pumped full of steroids, and they turn into political violence. There are plenty of examples of the downward spiral of sectional tensions that I cover in my Causes of the Civil War video. But a couple of brief examples are the mini-civil war in Kansas called Bleeding Kansas, the physical beating of Northern Senator Charles Sumner by Southern Representative Preston Brooks. This was because of a speech Sumner gave against slavery and Southern society. And one of the greatest Americans to ever live, John Brown, who after participating in the violence in Kansas, went on to plan and execute a raid on the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry. He was trying to start a slave uprising. During and after the Mexican-American War, the population of California boomed because of the gold rush. This allowed it to apply for statehood shortly after becoming a part of the United States. California was a large territory that crossed over the Missouri Compromise line. The politicians in California did not want slavery in their territory. And before you think California was some bastion of progressive abolitionists in 1849, know that they treated local native tribes terribly, with the governor calling for genocidal campaigns against them. It was more that slavery was not a part of that state's culture. The southern part of the state was very lightly populated, and California politicians did not want to break up the territory. So compromises worked up in Congress. It also involved other issues, including the territory of Texas. But the two most important things for APUSH is that California entered as a free state, which somewhat violated the Missouri Compromise line. This annoyed the Southerners. However, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was also a part of the compromise, which strengthened the previous fugitive slave law. With this part, abolitionists were appalled, and even Northerners, who are not ardent abolitionists, felt the act was violating Northern states' sovereignty and free soil. Next, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Great Plains were slowly increasing in population, and with the Missouri Compromise line already in question because of California statehood, it would really be on life support after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as that split the Nebraska territory into two and allowed settlers there to decide upon slavery with the notion of popular sovereignty, an idea that was championed by Congressman Stephen Douglas. The idea and act are supported in the South, and however, many in the North are against it, as they fear it will open up all the territories to slavery. The act also leads to the infamous Bleeding Kansas that was discussed before. Dred Scott versus Sanford is arguably the worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. I made a full video about this important case, so check that out. The link is in the video info below. To briefly summarize, Dred Scott was fighting for his freedom in the courts, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice, Roger Taney, would write the very controversial 7-2 decision against Dred Scott. He stated that, quote, "The question is simply this: can a black whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen," end quote. The Supreme Court's answer was no, and even took it a step further to include all black people, slave or free. Taney argued that the court has no jurisdiction over Dred Scott because he is not a citizen. Taney then went even further and took a very bold step in striking down the Missouri Compromise, which, depending on how a person interpreted the decision, made it seem like slavery was now open in all the territories, and possibly all the states. The American Party, for us in APUSH, straddles period 4 and 5. The political party taps into xenophobic, or also termed nativist, feelings of some of the American population. In the 1840s and 1850s, there was an increase in migration of Irish and Germans, especially in the North. Irish were escaping the potato famine, and other Europeans, especially Germans, saw a political upheaval with revolutions occurring across the continent. They did not receive a warm welcome in the U.S. Many Americans were Protestant with a general fear and dislike of Catholicism, which some of the Germans and most of the Irish were. There were long-held feelings of prejudice towards the Irish, stemming from earlier British feelings. A whole political party springs up in the 1850s to try and restrict immigration, called the American Party, or Know Nothings. They will see a small amount of political success. However, they, along with the rest of the country, will be swept up into the coming storm of the Civil War. In 1846, there was an attempt to ban slavery in any of the newly acquired territories from Mexico, called the Wilmot Proviso. It failed, but frustrated anti-slavery Whigs, called conscious Whigs, formed an influential minor party called the Free Soil Party. Their goals were to keep slavery out of the territories and make land available for poor settlers so they did not have to compete with large plantations and wealthy owners. The party lasted from 1848 to 1854, when it merged with the Republican Party and made up an influential faction of that new major party. In the mid-1850s, a major political realignment occurred as the Whigs completely dissolved and the Democrats became a regional party, only strong in the South. Free Soilers and Whigs, along with Northern voters, helped to form a new major party, the Republican Party, first established in the great state of Wisconsin in the town of Ripon, also known for good cookies. It grew rapidly in the mid-1850s and was made up of former Whigs and Free Soilers. Very similar to the Free Soil Party, the Republican Party wanted to limit the expansion of slavery in the territories and also wanted to institute economic reforms. Another major plank of the party was to make available land for cheap or free to the settlers. Eventually, this leads to the Homestead Act of 1862. After the election of 1860, but before Lincoln officially took office, southern states led by South Carolina began to secede, or to put it another way, break away from the United States. Southern politicians and even the outgoing President Buchanan argued it was a state's right to break away from the Union since they voluntarily entered it decades prior. Keep in mind, Buchanan is typically listed as the worst, or at least in the bottom 5 of presidents in history of the United States. Republicans, who now control the legislative and executive branches, disagreed and refused to recognize the secession of southern states. So we're going to go a little deeper with defining the Union and Confederacy than the other topics. This will give us a good idea of the vast differences between the two regions. The Union is all the states in blue on the map. The dark blue are the free states in the Union. This is where slavery is totally banned. The light blue are also called the border states. They officially stay in the Union, although there are definitely Confederate elements and sympathizers. In those states, slavery is still active. Lincoln was very concerned with keeping those states in the Union, and when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which officially as a government policy freed slaves, it did not apply to those light blue border states, only states that are in rebellion, so the Confederacy, of which the Confederacy are all the states in red on the map, and all have slavery. Continue now defining the regions. The North had incredible advantages in manpower and industry. Their total population is 2.5 times that of the South, with freemen being 4.5 times that of the South. The North has most of the wealth of the country, and we can see huge advantages in industry and farm goods. Finally, for the Union, we see a far more developed transportation network from railroad mileage to naval tonnage, as the Union has a greater amount of both merchant and naval resources. The South does have some advantages of their own. For one, they don't have to win the war. They just need the Union to quit fighting it. They have a lot of local support, and much of the war will be fought within their territory, giving it the advantage of knowing the terrain. Morale will also be higher in the South, as many, even non-slaveholders, will buy into the notion of seeking independence from, in their view, the tyrannical Lincoln. There is also a greater military tradition of the South, with an experienced officer corps of talented generals, many of them veterans of the Mexican-American War. The South also has a hot commodity, cotton, which they can trade for necessary items from England and France, although the North will make that very difficult, which leads us to the Anaconda Plan, which was Union General Winfield Scott's overarching plan to win the war. Major aspects of the plan include blockading Confederate ports so they cannot trade for necessary items, especially Great Britain and France. Also, to take control of the whole Mississippi River, which would cut the Confederacy in half. The plan was supposed to limit bloodshed, as the goal would be to stop the Confederacy's ability to wage war. However, it would fail in that respect, as bloody battles would rage for 4 years. However, the blockades and control of the Mississippi River would be an important aspect of the Union's victory. Another aspect of the Union victory would be employing the concept of total or hard war. This can be seen in the Union General Sherman's March to the Sea. In 1864, General Sherman with 60,000 soldiers left supply and communication lines with the rest of the Union Army and marched through Georgia, burning crops and destroying the little industry the South had. When he successfully took Atlanta, it proved to be a great boost to Lincoln's re-election bid. Sherman felt that in order to win the war, the economy and morale of the South had to be shattered. And the best way to do that was to show the Confederacy that Union armies can march through any part of their territory unimpeded and do what they like. This was also, in his view, the nature of war. And Sherman dismissed the romantic notion of war of just being two armies battling it out on the field. Total or hard war would bring the destruction to all aspects of the enemy's society, and thus bring about a more swift end to the war. His armies marched through Georgia, and the subsequent march to the Carolinas were highly successful in its aims. Shortly after the Confederacy's surrender and the end of slavery, many parts of the South passed restrictive laws designed to limit freedom for blacks. These codes limited movement and many other activities, and if fully implemented, would look a lot like slavery. They would be short-lived, though, as radical Republicans would pass amendments and civil rights acts that nullified the codes. However, after the end of Reconstruction, many of the Jim Crow laws mirrored the black codes and restricted freedom to blacks across the South. And speaking of those radical Republicans, let's take a quick look at them. So they are a faction of congressmen that, led by Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, were upset with President Andrew Johnson's handling of Reconstruction. They wanted more change and freedoms for blacks. They politically wrestled control over Reconstruction from President Johnson to the Congress, and also passed civil rights acts and the 14th and 15th Amendments. I made a video about those Reconstruction amendments. The link is below to learn more about them. Another major aspect of Reconstruction was the Freedmen's Bureau. The federal agency was created to help former slaves adapt to freedom and reconnect family members lost through the slave trade. They also helped to educate former slaves, assisted them in obtaining property, set up a bank, although that bank will suffer from corruption and eventually be done away with. Overall, though, the Freedmen's Bureau served as a physical arm of the federal government in Reconstruction in the South. An important economic term is the sharecropping system. This develops in the post-Civil War South. Both poor white and black farmers will suffer under this system. However, far more blacks than whites. It works like this. A poor farmer receives or rents land from a wealthy landowner. The poor farmer promises a share of what he produces on his allotment of land. Also, typically, the poor farmer is dependent upon the wealthy landowner for farming materials and other necessities. And usually the poor farmer, aka sharecropper, ends up in so much debt to the wealthy landowner, they never see a way out, and they become tied to the wealthy landowner and his plantation. Finally, we have the Compromise of 1877, otherwise known as the end of Reconstruction. The election of 1876 pitted Republican Rutherford B. Hayes against Samuel Tilden, a Northern Democrat. The election was closely contested with no clear winner. In Congress, a deal was struck in which the Republican Hayes would become president, with the promise of withdrawing federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. After which white Southerners took back control of political power and passed segregationist Jim Crow laws, like the black codes before, that limited freedom and rights of blacks. These laws would be in place for many decades and would take the civil rights movement in the 20th century to dismantle. Hey everyone, today we're going to explain the key terms for Period 6 of AP US History. This would be a great way to either start the unit or review before a test. Many of these terms come directly from the College Board framework, so are likely to be vocabulary seen on AP exams. Okay, let's go. First, let's start off with the Homestead Act. While the Act occurred in Period 5, it would have major effects in Period 6. It provided an avenue for any citizen to attain a sizable amount of land for nearly free. All the settler needed to do was pay $18 in fees and in some way develop the land over a 5-year period. That means building some sort of dwelling or infrastructure, farming, mining, or cattle ranching on it. This was a huge draw for people struggling in cities in the East, and also for people to immigrate from Europe to America. However, increasing amounts of settlers across the West brought upon conflict with many native tribes. After decades of war and the destruction of many native tribes' main resource, the buffalo, what was left of them were forced onto reservations. Then came about the Dawes Act, which sought to Americanize Indians. And I hope the irony of that is not lost on anyone. Many of the reservations were divided among families in 160-acre segments, similar to the Homestead Act. If a native renounced his tribal loyalties, then they were granted U.S. citizenship. The division of reservations would have a terrible effect, as many Indians would be swindled out of their land by speculators. Another aspect of the act were the boarding schools many native children were sent to, with the goal of to, quote, kill the Indian, but save the man, end quote. The schools attempted to indoctrinate native children into white American culture. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed early in this era. It was a long-held dream of many to connect the country by rail. The federal government subsidized the Central and Union Pacific companies to build the first Transcontinental Railroad. 2 more would also be built over the decades, providing a northern and southern transcontinental routes. These railroads also received highly valuable property around their lines they used to sell and rent to farmers and others. It leads to a railroad economy and immense power in the hands of railroad tycoons. Later in the era, the populist movement will rise in favor of more regulation of the railroads, but we will get to that later. The prevailing economic policy of the government in the time period is called laissez-faire, which means the government takes a hands-off approach to regulating the economy with few or no regulations of companies and few or no taxes. The thought process is that the invisible hand of the market will determine winners and losers. The most efficient and effective companies that produce goods and services that consumers want will make profits and expand, while other companies will go bankrupt. There is also an aspect of social Darwinism to this that we will get back to later as well. Keeping with the economic theme, this era is also known for the rise of industrial capitalism. The late 1800s saw the growth of giant industries utilizing heavy machines. Individual large companies employed tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of workers. This will have all sorts of effects, including the growth of a management class, also the growth of unions that fight for better wages and working conditions. The economies of scale and mass production techniques do lead to a decrease in the cost of certain goods for consumers. It also leads to another defining hallmark of period 6, which is the incredible amount of influence wealthy industrialists will have over government policy. One way these companies grew so large was vertical integration, in which they expanded by controlling several stages of production that might normally be done by separate companies. As the example in the graph shows, how the meat industry might try to own and control everything from the cattle to the slaughterhouse, transportation, and packaging of the meat. This gave the competitive advantage to companies that could achieve it and would significantly lower their costs and help drive out competitors. Another way companies in this era grew so large was horizontal integration, of which companies bought up competitors to increase their market share and decrease competition. This also led to monopolies in certain industries, most notably Standard Oil. Let's talk briefly about trusts and monopolies. We see these terms used interchangeably in the time period and sources, and they mean nearly the same thing. A trust is a conglomeration of companies with the same owners, usually being the major stockholders of the companies. They make sure the companies they own work together and not compete against each other. So it gives the allure that there are different companies competing, but in reality, they are not. Monopolies are businesses that have total or near control over entire sectors of an economy. We see this most prominently with the steel and oil industries. So many trusts would also be considered monopolies. There was a considerable amount of clamor from the general public for the government to take action against the trust and monopoly, and either regulate them or break them up completely. In one of the few examples of the government responding to public pleas in the economic realm, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. Corporations, of course, fought against it. And in this era, the act was somewhat ironically used, first against workers instead of large corporations. Government lawyers used it to go after large unions, insinuating unions were responsible for the lack of competition in the labor market. This just shows how much in the pocket government was of corporations during the era. In period 7, the act would actually be used for its intended purpose, as trust-busting presidents Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson will break up large monopolies. It will also be strengthened by the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. One of the most complex topics of the era is the debates over the gold standard. During the Civil War, state and local paper money was phased out with the National Banking Act of 1863. In its place were greenbacks, paper money that was printed by the Treasury and backed by gold. The value of greenbacks fluctuated by the supply of both gold and paper money in circulation. Wealthy industrialists and banks tended to favor this gold standard, as it was seen as stable and not inflationary. However, it came under heavy pressure from other groups that wanted a different monetary system. One group was a minor political party called the Greenback Party, and another was the farmer-backed Populist Party. Both favored either bimetallism, meaning a currency backed by gold and silver, or even the more radical idea of a currency not backed by any metal. Both of these approaches would allow for more inflation, which means money would decrease in value. That would help farmers because their farm goods from livestock to corn would be worth more, and hurt banks as it would mean their loans would decrease in value over time. This was a very serious political and economic debate in the era, culminating as a major issue in the 1896 presidential election. The gold supporters, or bugs, as they were called, would hold out in this time period. However, big changes in the monetary system would happen in periods 7 and 8. Tenant farming, along with its sibling sharecropping, emerged as a major post-Civil War agricultural system in the South and West. Many plantations were broken up into smaller segments that wealthy landowners still controlled. A poor tenant farmer worked a small segment. the tenant would purchase his food and supplies from a country store on credit, sometimes even owned by the plantation owner. Once the crops were harvested by the tenant farmer and sold by the wealthy landowner, a portion of the profit was used to pay off the tenant farmer's debt for the food and supplies. The system is similar to sharecropping and led to many poor farmers being in debt. They were also disproportionately black and stuck in an economic system similar to serfdom. After the conclusion of the Civil War, there was an idea floated that the South can modernize and industrialize like the North. Capitalism and industry can replace the agriculturally dependent economy of the South. Some, like the prominent black leader and former slave Booker T. Washington, advocated for freedmen to be the free labor needed in Southern factories, instead of an immigrant-based labor in the North. This is an inspiration for his famous Atlanta Compromise speech, which is an important primary source in APUSH. For more information on it, click on the link in the video notes below. As mentioned earlier, a backlash occurred against the economic and political power of railroads. This is most prominent in the Populist or People's Party. Across the Great Plains, Upper Midwest, and South, Grange and Farmers Alliance movements sprung up in support of local and regional farmers against the railroads. These organizations would converge and form a political party. The Populist Party channeled the frustration of the laissez-faire attitude of the federal government and the cycle of falling prices from farm goods, scarce money, and debt. Some of the goals of this influential third party were tariff reduction, a graduated income tax on the wealthy, public ownership of railroads, which is a radical proposal, popular election of senators, and currency reform, as mentioned earlier in the gold standard slide. Shifting focus to another aspect of the era, there were an increasingly large number of immigrants coming to U.S. shores. More Southern and Eastern Europeans were arriving, and as typical, the response from Americans was either xenophobic, with a demand for quotas that would limit immigration, or a worry about how to assimilate these new groups. In response to pressure on immigrants to Americanize, they both tried to adopt American norms, but also hold on to their heritage at the same time. Political machines are a political party organization headed by a single boss or small autocratic group. They work to win elections and control important political and administrative roles of a city, county, or state. In this era, they had great power and influence in the rapidly growing cities. They were able to effectively garner votes from immigrant groups and in return provide some social services to those groups. While they may have helped enough people in order to win elections, political machines are most known for their rampant corruption. They manipulated elections, had shady practices in which they delved out lucrative government contracts, and how they distributed tax money was always in question. New York's Tammany Hall and the leader Boss Tweed is the best example of this. A term that you might see a lot to describe period 6 is the Gilded Age. More specifically, it represents this period as a time of rapid economic growth, but also a lot of social conflict and political corruption. To be gilded means covered with gold on the outside, but not golden on the inside. Maybe some other material like bronze or copper. This signifies the incredible wealth of a few during the era, but many were living in terrible poverty and conditions in crowded city slums or farmers under incredible debt. A way some justify the incredible economic inequality was social Darwinism, which was taking Darwinian ideas of natural selection in the natural world and applying them to humanity. If a person did that in this era, they concluded that those on top of the human evolutionary ladder were the wealthy industrialists and academics. It gave comfort and justification to those looking to excuse their wealth while millions lived in squalor. The idea would also be applied to global matters and justify American and European imperialism. A work titled White Man's Burden presented the idea that it was their job to civilize the world. It provided a convenient cover for the exploitation of resources in foreign lands. Later in period 7, it would get worse, as the idea leads to the eugenics movement and the sterilization of thousands of women. The social gospel is a movement of a number of artists and critics, including agrarians, utopians, socialists, and advocates who championed an alternative vision for the economy and society, one that combats the cold social Darwinist views. They focused Christian ethics for the problems of U.S. society. So there is always a little bit of confusion over the social gospel and progressive movements, which I will talk about next. Do note, they cross over with each other. Great examples include Jane Addams and her Hull House movement, along with Jacob Riis, and his groundbreaking photographic work in his piece covering life in the slums titled How the Other Half Lives. Two of the main leaders specific to the social gospel movement itself are Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. Speaking of progressives, they were middle-class reformers, many highly educated, that sought to apply the principles of their professions to solving the problems of society. They had a strong faith in progress and the ability of educated people to overcome societal problems. The progressives are first making an appearance here, but note, we'll talk about them even more in period 7, including a whole progressive era. Brought up earlier as an example of both the social gospel and progressive movements, Jane Addams and the Hull House movement is a definite need to know in APUSH. Beginning in Chicago and then spreading to cities across the country, Hull Houses had the goal of aiding and Americanizing immigrants. They had classes taught on English and American culture, and also provided other social services, including meals and children's services. The Sierra Club, still operating today, was founded by John Muir in 1892. Muir and the organization are well known for their efforts to preserve natural spaces. They advocated the setting aside of specific areas to become national parks in which Americans can enjoy for their beauty and recreation. So one thing to make note of is the differences between national parks and forests, of which there are many and cover vast swaths of land. National parks are more in line with Muir and the Sierra Club's ideas of preservation. The land is an end in itself and should not be exploited for commercial gain. National forests have two goals. They share the park's goal of being a place for recreational activities, but they are also managed for industry as well. So in a national forest, you might see areas of logging and cattle ranching. Our last term is another one that crosses over time periods, 6 and 7, in between social gospel and progressive reformers. Muckrakers were investigative journalists who wrote long-form pieces for magazines or books. They exposed government and corporate corruption. A great example of that was Ida Tarbell's History of Standard Oil. They highlighted terrible living and working conditions, like the already mentioned How the Other Half Lives, and Upton Sinclair's famous work, The Jungle, which I highly recommend. And they worked on civil rights issues. One of the most famous examples is Ida B. Wells' Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases. Okay, that does it for period 6 key terms. Hopefully this will help give you some background information as you either begin to tackle the time period or help you review for the exam.